welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this next of our IRIS webinars. Glad you could do it. You can see that I am, well, if you haven't met me, I'm Greg Lang. I'm the IRIS trainer in communications for the County Road Program and the IRIS program, those kind of things. We're joined by both, or not both, but all with Casper Leonard, who's the IT director, Ken Smith, who does our database administration, Tom Emery is one of the programmers, and Raymond Dennison, he's also one of the programmers for us. So you'll get to know these names and people as the IRIS 10 continues to roll and do these things, but we just wanted to do that. I am recording the webinar, so I just wanted to let you know that so we can both review that as well. We'll have it on our YouTube channel when we're all done. And so just wanted you to know that, and we'll send out all of those links. And Brian Worley has also joined us. He is the director of the County Road Program, so he'll be in the background, and he'll, if we need anything as well. What I would like to do, though, is at least start off to give you some ideas of some of your screen controls. If you're not familiar or as familiar with this, you do have your screen controls with the microphone to turn it on. I can also let everybody have their microphones on. I would just ask that you mute your microphone while we're doing some of the presentations. Especially too, if you have to leave or get out of the room, try not to put your telephone, if you're calling in by the telephone instead of a microphone on your or your computer, try not to put your telephone on hold, because we'll get the hold music through, and if we unmute everybody, we'll get that to everybody. You can turn your camera on and off if you want. Don't think we'll need to share a lot of the extra screens, but they are there if you need that, and we can certainly give you that. The chat function, which would be in the upper right area of yours, that's where you can send us chats, information. Just make sure that you want to send it to everybody or select who you'd like to send it to. So if you're trying to say something about Greg's really boring, that it goes to the people you want versus everybody. But in fact, let's get started with that chat. Why don't you go into the chat, tell us who you are, what county or agency you're from, and what your job function or title is, just so we know who's there. The other thing that you do have while you're sending and doing that information is the viewing option, which is at the very top of your screen. You can actually place it to be just the active camera, nobody, whatever you want, so you can get the screen larger during the slides and during the screenshots and the actual animations and things like that. So you can always change the way your view is going there. So I'm going to stop sharing now and take a peek and see who we have. Got bunches of that. Columbia County, more Columbia County, Washington County, Jackson County. So we have several people on. So it's good to know. We got a lot of the states starting to be represented. So I appreciate that. So we'll know who. And again, if you have questions or things as we're going on, and you want to make that question or whatever, and we've got plenty of question and answer times, so don't worry that it won't, but if you want to make sure that we get that and that we don't forget it or you don't forget it, send it to us on a chat or anything like that so we can review back on those questions as well. With that, I'm actually going to turn the controls over to Casper, who's going to walk us through this utilizing the data and pulling data from IRIS for your specific uses. So Casper, our IT director, I am going to turn it over to you.
All right, so I'm Casper Leonard. I'm the IT director for most of the IRIS program. As we presented in the previous webinar, we are going to be very focused this time on just data transfers, predominantly getting data out of IRIS and into third-party systems. I'm going to blow through all of the current transfer methods that are predominantly used and try to do this fairly quickly so that we can cover what is currently being used by counties in 9, as well as what's coming with 10, so that there's plenty of time for Q&A and also some time for Ken Smith, our database developer, to cover some of the changes that are being made in preparation for 10 and things that he is working on that he will be reaching out to certain counties to talk about. So to get started, I will give us some basic little diagrams. So the first version we have here This is the most common way people get things in and out of the system. And this is with a report export. So this is a simple, usually as a CSV or an Excel dump of some kind that is sent over manually each month or pay period or something for transferring between systems. This is also one of the older methods in IRIS for doing transfers. A lot of counties use this, usually with payroll for validation, things like that, timekeeping. This is very labor intensive comparatively. So we try to discourage people from doing this too much if it is something that has to be done very routinely. What a lot of counties are actually doing is pulling a nightly backup of their data system. So in this case, we are actually backing up the entire IRIS database as it sits on our systems. And we are making it available for those counties who have requested access for third-party systems via an FTP connection or another connection if that's required, but predominantly it's FTP. Once the system makes that file, it compresses it and basically just drops it in the bucket waiting for pickup. You can write whatever system you want around the handling of the file. The current systems that I know of that are using this method typically are either GIS systems pulling in asset information or a few systems that are pulling back coding for cost accounting. But there's quite a few that are using it that I don't exactly know how they're using it. They've just got some sort of middleware that is using the system. In the nightly backup system, the downside to this is it is once every 24 hours. So you do have some stale data, and the systems written on the other end need to actively be functioning to go collect that data. So there isn't any sort of push coming from our side. It's a very passive system from our end that you would have to choose to pull your data and use it. Now, there is also a connection that is a direct connection for our SQL server that currently I believe only one county is using, but this would allow active SQL queries to be passed directly to our server configuration. Now, in this situation, you have to have more of an IT support base because you will be having to actually structure and make SQL calls based on the structures of the data that are there and be getting back the raw structures as they are in the IRIS system. But this allows for immediate real-time data. So if you have a system that is very dependent on being able to pull changes that have just been committed through IRIS recently, this would be more what would be required. This is also going to be a little more technically cumbersome if you do not have a system in place to store the data you're working with. This is supposed to be an import or export, because this won't be going to a static file to be referenced. This will be an active SQL connection. So unless you pull it back and store it in your own SQL database or commit this to something else to be imported into a third-party system, it's essentially only an active use situation. Now, an example of a two-way communication, predominantly in IRIS, especially for third-party systems, we don't allow two-way. We only allow data to be pulled out to prevent the corruption of data or insertion of bad data into the system. But the only current two-way system is IRIS Remote. And so IRIS Remote, for those of you not familiar, is the system that we provide that is essentially a light version of IRIS 9 that is installed on notebooks, taken into the field offline. It allows the entry of inspection information. Then when you return to the office, you can synchronize those changes back up to the data server. So in that structure of data passing, it does both pull down data for synchronization to be used in the field and returns data for the inspection entries that are being allowed back into the system. Now, even though this is what we consider one of the methods for data moving in and out of IRIS, this is one that is still under our control so that we've structured everything, and the database that is on that machine is a scaled down version of IRIS. So all of the data integrity is enforced the same way it would be in the main IRIS system. Now, we haven't pushed the use of this in large scale across all the counties because without a good business case, this adds a lot of overhead to management because you must have a dedicated piece of hardware with a full Microsoft SQL Server installation. It has to have a specialized client installed, and it has to have all the security permissions and everything configured as expected by our system for synchronization. So it is a pretty cumbersome system to set up. Now, we are going to be moving to IRIS 10 in the not too distant future, and one of the major components to this is the API system that underlies the entire application. So now, to simplify everything down, what an API essentially does is it provides you an interface to the data that is regulated and formatted for specific purposes. So in this case, we have a layer that's now been created that can emulate any of the 3 other main data transfer methods we already have, but you can build around it and it will self-describe to you how you can expect the data to be returned and what it expects to be supplied in order to make the call. So much like a direct connection, you can have access to live data, but instead of having to know exactly how to structure and statically build your SQL calls, you simply submit your request to the API as it requires it. And if changes have happened in data structures or if we've changed models, it will be reflected automatically and still format back to what you're expecting for your return. Now, one of the other benefits is the security side of the system. So the API is essentially always available, but you will control who has access and when and what to within the system. So the basic functionality is such that you will be able to have a third-party application, whether you develop it internally or externally, and if that system needs, for instance, access to the GIS data, instead of doing what is currently required every night of pulling down a nightly backup of the entire data set and then parsing through it and reformatting it to what you need for your other application, you could write a direct connection between your GIS application and the API and have it scheduled to pull down data on an interval that is more befitting your application. So if it's something that needs hourly accuracy, you could schedule it around that system, or you could still do it every 24 hours once you've validated whatever content is currently in IRIS to make sure you want it displayed in the GIS system. Now, the IRIS 10 API flow of data compared to the other models is very much like this for most cases. There are some specialized cases, and I'll go into those a little bit later, where we are using the system because we are also using the API. So whatever we are doing with the system, you in theory will have access to do yourselves via the API and building your own enhancements off of that structure. But essentially the way it works is you will be able to prescribe a key to a third party or an internal user who will build a external system custom process of some kind off of this. That could be something web-based, that could be some sort of middleware to a financial system, or that could be some sort of direct call for a GIS system. That will know the request structure that the API is expecting, and it will supply its credentials, basically asking permission to fetch that data. When you created that key, you have the ability to specify what in the system that key has permission to utilize. So when you set it up, if this system should only ever have access to GIS data for culverts, for example, you can limit it down to only that specific set of data, so they can't be pulling or interacting with cost accounting data, for example. When that key is supplied, the API now knows exactly what scope of permissions that request has, and then it can compare it to what it's asking for to ensure that is what they are allowed to have access to. And if it is valid, the API will translate that request into a SQL that is sufficient for whichever system it's going to be querying from. The database server will process and return the raw data to the API, which will be packaged and processed into a model befitting the return. And it will probably, in most cases, be wrapped in JSON format or something fairly universal to be consumed on the other end. Now, because this API is also something that we have on our side, if there's very specialized situations where systems need to have the response specifically tailored to them, we can do so. And this will give us a specific intermediary layer to build enhancements for third-party integrations with things like fuel systems, cost accounting systems, or if you're doing something like Esri data requests. Now, I referenced IRIS 9 remote before because that was an example of a two-way data connection. In IRIS 10, we will be replicating the remote system, and creatively we're calling it IRIS 10 remote. But this system is basically doing all of the same basic functionality, but is entirely built around the new API. So this system will still allow you to synchronize the data offline to a laptop, take it out into the field, collect your culvert or sign or whatever inspection data you're dealing with, collect your GIS information while you're out there, and then return back and synchronize it back into the database. Now, this system is still going to be somewhat niche in its application because it still requires that you have the local tech support and the local hardware support to be able to facilitate the installation and management of it on your systems. Because the entire time it is disconnected from IRIS, it's at the mercy of the users to ensure that they're following good practices in preserving data integrity, as well as ensuring that they synchronize the changes back up in a timely fashion so that we don't have 2-year-old data trying to be resynced into the system. Now, we currently have only about 3 or 4 counties using IRIS Remote in version 9. In version 10, we'll be reaching out to those counties to get the testing initially for the new system, get the feedback, ensure that we are preserving enough features to still make it applicable to their uses before we turn around and start making it available to the rest of counties that don't have it currently deployed. Now, there's a scheduled webinar in September specifically focused around IRIS Remote, both IRIS 9 and IRIS 10. So if you have interest in this, either because you are preparing to do the beta and you haven't already, or if you are looking to start using the system and don't currently do it, that would be the webinar to participate in. We will run through a very specific rundown of exactly how it works, what exactly we know the hardware requirements are, and what the obligations are in implementing the system in your environment. Now, we have a very basic prototype of IRIS 10 remote available. So I'm going to jump over there just to give you an idea of what the system looks like. Now, this is already logged in to the culvert screen of the system. So in this case, in this sample data that we have a list of culverts here. We have inspection information for the culverts down below, and we have a basic Esri map over here of the GIS information associated with that culvert. In IRIS 9, you enter GIS information typically by text, and it's usually plugged in through the XYZ or lat long information in the system. In 10, we have direct integration with the Esri tool to be able to view the mapping. It also has, in this case, it is pulling these maps from the online data source, but when offline, it carries its own localized maps with it to still give you points of reference while you're collecting the data. In addition, instead of requiring it to be keyed in, we are allowing the users to simply update a feature location by pulling the GIS information from whatever GPS unit is attached to the laptop and feed that directly in. Now, of course, there's still going to be variances or potential inaccuracies in whatever unit you're using in the field that's connected to a laptop. So we'll also have the ability to override or correct it as necessary. This gives you a little bit of a method for at least validating what you're looking at to ensure you're in the right ballpark and find out if it already has any information associated with it. This system will be going out for testing in probably the next month or so, and once we have a fairly good beta established for some feedback from the system, we will be doing a broader availability test probably leading up to September's meeting or just after September's meeting. Now, to talk about why we were using the IRIS Remote 10 application as a reference, the system we are using here is using the API exactly as any other system you might create yourself would. The IRIS 10 application for this remote application specifically is reaching through the IRIS API to make requests of the data server and then being returned the data formatted as it needs for use in that application. Now, I say this remote application specifically because our IRIS 10 online application also passes through the API. So the API is actually a foundational layer to all of the systems now. So as you work to develop your own third-party applications or external applications using the system, we are also using it so that we can be testing it in live time and ensure that the system is behaving as expected. That also gives us a greater familiarity with it should we need to provide assistance when you go to develop your own complex applications. Now, this also is going to have some impacts on the way databases are structured in IRIS 10 versus IRIS 9. So IRIS 8 and IRIS 9 were more or less gradual organic transitions. The databases were modified and changed, and the versions of the databases were upgraded, but we weren't actually making entire rewrites and restructures to the system. For IRIS 10, in order to better comply with the needs of modern data as well as bigger data requirements, we are going to be cleaning up a lot of legacy systems, correcting a lot of holdover structures that weren't ideal for some of the relationships that we're trying to enforce now. And we're going to be cleaning up a lot of data contained within the structures that is either no longer applicable or was collected in a way that didn't make it accurate to what it was attempting to represent. So for certain counties out there, we found data that is either orphaned or no longer usable, or was just collected in a way that didn't work with any sort of external systems that we will be cleaning up and hopefully updating. And as we do so, we'll be reaching out to each county individually to let them know what to expect and to find out how they would like us to proceed. Now, we don't want to be making any changes to data that you're currently using if you have a good reason that you're using it in that particular way. What may look like typos or orphan data to us may actually still be in use. So Ken Smith, our database administrator, will be reaching out to ensure that we have a good understanding of why the data looks the way it does before we attempt to rectify the situation. Now, to go into a little more detail about this particular issue, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Ken Smith. He will have a small presentation and a better explanation of what he's looking for.
Thank you, Casper. Yeah, my name is Ken Smith, and I'm the database administrator, and been working to try to help facilitate the migration to IRIS 10. And one of the first things that we're doing is to simplify things and ensure consistency between all the 34 different databases that we currently have, because right now every single county has its own database, and that's has provided some issues and some problems about trying to maintain all the database code the same between each of the different databases. We're going to be moving all of those databases into a single multi-tenant database. There still will be security in place that will ensure that a county only has access to their data and no one else's. So there's going to be security involved there. You don't have to worry about anybody being able to go in and see your data or muck it up. It will be a truly multi-tenant database. The advantage of this, though, is that it will make sure that we have a consistent code base between all the different databases. The other thing that I'll be doing with the IRIS 10 is enforcing some data integrity. One of the things that we had with IRIS 9 is not all of the different situations were enforced. Casper mentioned the things about orphan records. What that is let's say that you have a culvert and you have multiple inspections. If something went awry during a delete or something went awry with a system administration in the back and you deleted a culvert, it could leave the inspections laying out in the database. And those are what we call orphan records. Then IRIS 10, that is not going to be allowed. The database will automatically take care of that, and it's going to handle that sort of thing. The other thing that we are going to be doing is trying to move those different kinds of places where we had inconsistent entries. For example, in the permit screens, we had a field that people could type in for the surface type. And looking in there, I have seen examples where they typed in paved or pace or P or gravel spelled with an I. We're going to be trying to clean all that up and move that into a lookup value so that they're all consistent and they don't have the problem of being mistyped as you're going forward. Now, the impact of this, of course, is that IRIS-9, the bad data that we have there, is going to need to be dealt with before we do a full migration to IRIS-10. Because I won't allow those orphan records, or we want to these lookup values, we're going to have to go through and fix those things as we move people into IRIS-10. But we don't want to make sure, we want to make sure that we don't cause any problems with your data or the way that you're using it. So before we make these kinds of wholesale changes, I'm going to be reaching out to you to help coordinate that cleanup in the very near future. Now, as far as GIS data goes, we've got several different things going on. For those of you who may not know, IRIS-9 has basically GIS data, which it stores as coordinate values, X, Ys. And we have those for these different features. We got accidents, approaches, bridge, catchphrases, cul-de-sacs, culverts, gates, intersections, manholes, monuments, railroad crossings, signals, signs, and utility and wheelchairs. Those are all available for storing GIS information about. And currently in IRIS-9, we have over 36,000 features with GIS data. And those are primarily signs, culverts, and bridges. And the vast majority of that information is across 5 different counties. That kind of gives you an idea for how well utilized the GIS information is in IRIS-9. What I'm currently working on is trying to do some cleanup around this. In those coordinate values, we've had some projected coordinates. Those are sometimes they would be like a certain coordinate system. Those values would be in there. Sometimes people would put GPS in there, and sometimes they would have the longitude as either a easting or westing, mainly like a minus or a positive. There would be some issues with the GPS and where they would reverse the XY fields. So I'm kind of going through and trying to clean that information up so that it is consistent across the board. Also, I'm looking for additional sources of location information. For example, ODOT bridge data has GPS coordinates available to them. I was able to match things up, and I could add another 1,600 bridge locations into our current IRIS system that we can incorporate into our system. And also sometimes people have entered in GPS entries in their user fields. So I'll be pouring through the database, trying to find those locations and capitalize on information that people have typed into their user fields so that we can actually put them in places and we can use them appropriately for GIS. And as far as sharing or obtaining GIS data, we're currently working on prototypes that will allow you to get the GIS data either directly from the API that Casper was talking about. We are working on an ESRI format or a file geodatabase that you can download to your local machine and access using our ESRI products. Also, we're working on creating KML maps or Google Map files that you can display up on Google Maps, Google Earth specifically. If you don't have any kind of GIS capability, you can at least display them in KML on Google Maps. And finally, we are working on sharing this information with the counties via ARC Online, which is another ESRI cloud service for GIS data. Now, this work is all still in progress, and we are working on that kind of stuff. And there's some of these things may require some additional resources for you to get real-time updates, but at least it would be within weekly or daily is what we're working towards for being able to provide like the downloads for the formats and the Google Maps and the ARC Online sharing and whatnot. We're going to be going into much more detail on GIS in our next webinar. So if you have an interest, or you know somebody in your agency who does have an interest in this, please tune into our next webinar. Now, at this point, I'm going to turn things back over to Greg, who can field questions, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have.
So far, we don't have any in the chat box, but we want to be really exciting here. I'm going to try to unmute all. So if you haven't purposely muted, if you have a question, please speak up, or at least put it in the chat and we can ask the appropriate person for that. Are there any questions on stuff we've covered so far? Again, we are working on all of these. Maybe you have a specific question for your county. Please don't hesitate to contact us. You can always get a hold of me at glang@oregoncounties.org, and we can field that to your appropriate person. Are you sure no questions? We're here to answer them for you. This webinar will make it available as well if you came in late, or you know someone who really should have got this but they're out on a work assignment. We will make it available on our YouTube channel. We do have an County Road Program IRIS YouTube channel that will make that available for everybody. The slides will also be available for you, the slide deck that we've gone through, just so you can review that as well. And I'll also attach a link for a survey on, does this time work? Do the categories, do the things that we're talking about for webinars, is that meeting your needs, to make sure that we're in the right ballpark for you? So that is coming to you in your emails as well, but just wanted you to know for that. Doesn't look like we have any questions so far. Is there anything else that you would like to cover, Casper, on that?
We'll be going into a lot more show and tell in the GIS webinar that's following. I'm trying to avoid getting too far into Ken's prototype for the IRIS 10 remote right now, just to make sure that I have the latest version. But if you have any questions, or if you know if your county has any interest in needing external access, you will be able to reach out to Ken or myself to facilitate some sort of review of whether or not we can provide a direct connection or a nightly export or whatever you're looking for. Greg can always get in touch with us, and in general, we can have those systems set up pretty rapidly. And then we would need to work with someone, a key person on your side, to work with understanding the data structures and actually integrating it into whatever application you are looking to work with.
We did have a question, Casper, on just a general question on when is 10 going live. Can you just talk about the process of how we're looking to roll it out?
So 10 is rolling out in phases based on going from beta to live as a module by module system. Currently, we have 3 to 4 modules, depending on where you draw the line on things like IRIS Remote, that are in beta. And the full rollout for live should be happening next year, depending on how quickly we can get certain counties in to test the system. We aren't going to be pulling the plug on IRIS 9 until every county has a chance to begin to make the move into 10, evaluate the effectiveness of the current system, and make any changes they need to continue their business processes before they do a full transition. So it'll depend a lot on what the timetables of individual counties are as they look to start to make the move. But the target is next year, and it will really boil down to whether it falls in the end of spring or whether it has to be pushed off into the fall or toward the winter, depending on how busy everyone is with outdoor projects.
Good. And yes, there was another question. We will make sure that everybody has the YouTube link to get into our page for that. And as I said, I'll just have a couple of quick edits on this and then get it all posted up there, and we will have everything from there.
If anyone out there in particular really wants to get into the beta for these modules as they are being opened up, go ahead and reach out to Greg, and he can look at what you're currently doing in IRIS and let you know if there's something that isn't included currently in our beta plate for what you would have access to, and then at least make note of when he could get you in. Currently, we're still ironing out a few more revisions to reports. we're focused on the permit system, the service request system, IRIS 10 remote, and then we will be looking into moving into another auxiliary system, something like potentially weed spraying or something along those, depending on what the data interactions look like. I'm leaving it mostly up to Ken to decide what has the biggest data impact as we move forward, so that we can ensure that if you are using the IRIS 10 beta or using the IRIS 10 module specifically as your main entry source, that we're not having any issues of incongruency between your IRIS 9 data and your IRIS 10 data.
Also, Russell Campbell asked whether or not we would have complete online docs for use of the API. And yes, we'll probably be working very heavily on trying to create good documentation around it, and maybe perhaps provide some samples of the use of the API.
Good. Any other questions that anybody in the counties or that have that we can try to address? And we know that Douglas County is ready to go with IRIS 10 and the upgrades, as well as the remote. So we will keep that on our hit list as well. Well, if no other questions, I thank you everyone for coming today, and I know your time is valuable and we appreciate that. I will get all the links out to everybody. I'll get the survey out to everybody. If you haven't had a chance to take the survey, or you've changed your mind since you did take the survey, please fill that out, and be sure to join us in about 3 weeks here for the next webinar, which will cover a lot of the GIS information. I'll send out the tentative schedule as well with all that information. Thank you everybody for attending, and you guys have a great day.